let's actually get to the ivermectin stuff, because I think this is the place where we've seen the clearest glimpse so far of what this really was.
Mm-hmm.
And let's be careful about what we actually know. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So the interesting fact is that the Together trial, which was heralded, this trial was heralded as the largest randomized controlled trial of the effectiveness of ivermectin against COVID ever at the time it was released.
Mm-hmm.
It was released in a bizarre way, where we were given the result, the supposed negation of the utility of ivermectin, 6 months before the paper ever emerged. So we were shown effectively a slide from a talk that claimed that they had tested ivermectin and it didn't work, and the largest randomized controlled trial, which we are told erroneously is the gold standard of evidence, but nonetheless we were told this, and then we had to wait 6 months to see the paper. So there were all of these headlines that said what the result of the randomized controlled trial had been, no ability to check whether the methodology made any sense, whether the trial was in fact underpowered, the way pharma typically makes these trials so that they will show no efficacy of a competing compound to something that they wish to sell. We couldn't see that. And then the paper finally emerges, and lo and behold, a whole new set of headlines emerges, as if there's been some second major randomized controlled trial, but in fact it's the same one. Mm-hmm. The methods section is opaque, so even figuring out what they did is extremely difficult. I would advise people to look at Alexandros Marinos's publications on the Together trial. It's jaw-dropping what they did. It was underpowered. It was underpowered in a way that was utterly systematic and cryptic. You know, in other words, they had a cutoff, among other things. They had a cutoff for weight, and so that they increased the dosage with weight, which makes sense, and then they had a cutoff at which they stopped increasing it. So
yeah, they didn't have a cutoff for weight of the participants. The participants could be as obese as they needed to be, but the dosage stopped increasing at some weight of the participants in the trial.
Right, and so because COVID is serious proportionally to weight, the idea of underdosing people, as they get, if you cap the dosage at a per kilogram level, and then as people add kilograms, you stop increasing the dosage, you are systematically underdosing people. The heavier they are, the more underdosed they are. That is exactly a cryptic way to say, oh, the dose was high, it was X per kilogram.
Yeah. The obese people are more likely to have been badly affected by COVID in the first place. The obese people have been underdosed for the possible treatment, and so they are least likely to be positively affected by the treatment. Also being, the people most likely to have a bad outcome from COVID.
Right. So this was not the only way in which the trial was underpowered, but it's one of them. Also, I should point out that the trial promised to release their data and still has not done so. But in any case, you've got this trial.
It's hard to follow the science under these circumstances.
Yeah, you can follow the headline is about all you can do.
Okay.
But in any case, you have this trial, appallingly run, that FTX shows up as a... Actually, Zach, can you show my tweet on this? Well, so the first screenshot that Zach is going to try to zoom in on here is a screenshot on the Together Trials website in which they reveal FTX as a funder. So
this is actually the second one. Can we go right?
Yep. Yeah. So go back. So Twitter is not working very well. Yep. Oh, there you go.
There we go.
So here it is, funded by FTX. Now let's be very clear.
And do we have a date on that? Can you read it, Brett? Zach?
No date.
No date. Okay.
The FTX funding of the Together trial arrives late, after the ivermectin arm. Now that does not, this is going to come back. It's interesting. Okay, so the funding of the Together trial by FTX is after the ivermectin arm.
After it's completed?
Yep. Now, go to the next screenshot.
The one I just showed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something's working here, by the way.
Okay. Here you can see this is a news release from May 16th, 2022. The FTX Foundation supports the global expansion of the Trial of the Year award-winning Together trial. So the Together Trial won something called the Trial of the Year from the FTX Foundation and was awarded $18 million in funding and purchase commitments. Now, it is not 100% obvious what is going on here. But $18 million is a huge amount of money in the realm
Can you just put that back up for a second, Zach? So I haven't seen this before, and I was just reading.
Sorry.
Yeah. So it's the Society for Clinical Trials, which is an existing society that I had never heard of before, has an existing award. So this is not a new award being announced this year, but the Together Trial wins the Society for Clinical Trials award this year, and they say that they award it based on 5 key criteria. But do they say what those 5 key criteria are here? They don't. Okay, that's what I wanted to see. It's not listed here. I don't know what they are.
So we can't know what this is, but we do know that a huge payment, $18 million in fact, flowed to people who had generated a trial that systematically sabotaged ivermectin in a way that was predicted, and that turns out to have been the case. We can't see the data, but we can see the methods, and to the extent that we can reverse engineer what they did, it is exactly what you would do if you wanted to demonstrate that ivermectin didn't work in spite of the fact that it does. Okay? So the question is, what role is this playing? Well, the blue team clearly has doubled down 100 times on the idea that ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine do not work for COVID. They have doubled down on the idea that the right way to address COVID is with the so-called COVID vaccinations. And so what you have is a cabal advancing a story about what does and doesn't work. That story is being sanitized and supported by garbage scientific work that is then rewarded at an extraordinary level by exactly this fraudulent entity that we have just discovered has been doing the bidding of the blue team and of the effective altruism movement.
And at the point that Vox pretends to appear to be waking up to some of what it has been complicit in, that Kelsey Piper story is number 1 on the Vox website right now, but number 4 most popular stories on the Vox website right now, when the Kelsey Piper story, supposedly revealing the depths of the depravity and awareness of Sam Bankman-Fried, is headlined "Going Home for the Holidays? Boost, mask, and test beforehand." So that's the same cabal pretending that either there's awareness or there isn't. Right? If this is still the stuff being published on Vox, at the same moment there's awareness over here about some of the tentacles that are all wrapped up in one another, and if you pull on one, you're going to find something really, really bad inside. What could be big enough to wake it all up, to wake up this beast, and to stop having an article recommending that you boost before you go see your family, for instance?
Well, one thing, and one of the reasons that I wanted to have this conversation on DarkHorse today, is I think it is really important not to jump to conclusions about what some scandalous entity in front of us is. In other words, I think we missed the boat with Enron. I think we figured out what was going on in the Enron building, but we didn't figure out what role it was playing in civilization.
Okay.
I think we are in danger of doing the same thing here. That the idea is we will accept something, salacious about what was taking place at FTX, and we will wag our fingers at them, and we will fail to understand what its real role in the universe was.
So Enron is when? Late 90s, early aughts? I don't actually remember. You want to look it up quickly, Zach?
Yeah. Like the Enron collapse or scandal?
Yeah. Google Enron, you'll immediately find just sort of when it all goes to hell. I think this is not then, whenever it was. It's it's a couple decades.
December 2001.
2001. Okay. Right after 9/11.
Well, according to Wikipedia, so who knows really? But
I think Wikipedia isn't wrong about that level of history yet. We're 21 years later. This is not then, but I know that it felt to those of us who were still dedicated Democrats at the time, and you said, Enron was a red team failure, right? That appeared to be, and I haven't seen anything that suggests that it wasn't orchestrated by and perpetuated by and done by a bunch of people who would have claimed to have been on Team Red, as it were. And there was, I'm sure, a fair bit of smugness and self-satisfactory backpatting on the part of various Democrats who might have been doing something similar but weren't discovered doing it. And part of what we're seeing here is, well, of course the other side would do it, and it's 21 years later, and they learned some things, and there's more technological capacity, and it's worse. It's going to take out a whole lot more than Enron did. And can we do something more than having Team Red be smug and Team Blue be in denial, which I think is kind of what happened with Enron.
Well,
Team Red was in denial and Team Blue was smug, and it's like, okay, great.
I think it's worse than that.
Sure.
We have looked at the tip of an iceberg. We don't know what the iceberg is, but we have looked at the tip of the iceberg, and this iceberg is involved in things that the blue team holds dear.
Mm-hmm.
It is involved in a case that we know well in apparently rewarding people for having run a fantastic randomized controlled trial that was in fact an appalling randomized controlled trial that just so happens to have concluded that a drug that everybody swears doesn't work, they concluded that it didn't work when the trial was set up in a way that would guarantee that outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So the obvious question is, in the absence of things like universities, science journals, newspapers, truth-seeking apparatus that works in the public's interest, in the absence of that, in the total vacuum of the ability of some institution to seek truth on our behalf, something is engineering the appearance of X, Y, and Z. In other words, there's a price point. If you want something to be a fact, ivermectin doesn't work. You want that to be a fact? Mm-hmm. That's going to cost you. It can be a fact, but it's going to cost you, right? Mm-hmm. It's going to cost you $18 million. Well, $18 million, that's a bargain compared to the money that will be made if ivermectin doesn't work, and we therefore...
It costs a lot more than $18 million.
Oh, no doubt.
That award is a tiny piece of it. I mean, if we're going to play that game, there's also the purchasing of all sorts of cheap offshore accounts to flood social media with snarky comments about how people advocating for ivermectin are killing people.
Right.
Right. So, there's all sorts of little branches of this that each cost some amount of money.
Sure. And I don't mean to suggest that $18 million is enough to do it. What I mean to suggest is we knew, and we said at the time, if somebody wants to go back through those broadcasts, they will find, we know that we are facing some incredibly powerful thing. We can feel what it is doing in and around this story. We don't know what it is. We don't know how it works. But that it exists is something that is apparent if you have attempted to sort out the truth of these repurposed drugs, for example. So that thing, it turns out, lived in part at FTX. It lived in part at Vox. It explains the odd behavior. And the thing that people...
Prediction, the Atlantic received some FTX-related money.
Well, the question is, how deeply are you going to have to dig? And how does this all work? And I will point out that I have argued that there are a couple different ways that this thing could work. One is it could hire people to write garbagey stories, to not put two and two together and advance their argument in the Atlantic or the New York Times or whatever. The other way is that it could basically cultivate freelancers. In other words, one thing that could explain something like the FTX trial is that you've got a bunch of people who understand, power really doesn't want ivermectin to compete with whatever the official treatments are. And so if you produce a trial that does that, if you function like an underling at Enron, where the superiors don't want to know what you're doing, what they want you to do is make the company look valuable on paper, right? If you took that same approach inside of science and you said, well, power seems to want this drug not to work, and so what kind of work do you have to do to suggest that? Maybe it will find me and reward me for doing that, right? So the point is that after the fact award could be the evolution of a system of you freelance either in journalism or on Twitter, as we've seen a bunch of self-appointed fraud seekers on Twitter who are interested in fraud on one side enough that they will invent it where it doesn't exist, and not the least bit interested in fraud coming from the other side. That's a conspicuous fact.
Sure.
Are those people looking to be rewarded by something, and does that thing look like this entity that we've now had a glimpse inside of, right? Is the purpose of all of the money flowing into this thing basically that it can reward and facilitate things which have a value to the team that's funding it, right? In other words, laundering doesn't really cover that, right? This is something beyond that. Is this an incentivizing engine, right, that is supposed to look like a business to explain why it has all of these resources, but maybe it's something beyond that?
Well, here we get back to your point that you called time traveling
money printer,
right? It's not. One thing that you could do is create history and know what you're creating and just be ahead of the game because you know what's going to happen because you're making it happen. And another thing that you can do is make sure that the thing that could send you in one direction, like, oh, actually, this is a treatable disease, doesn't get discovered by funding and favoring and buying accounts and voices that basically make sure that no one who you would want to have at a cocktail party would ever think that a horse dewormer could possibly be something you could just treat COVID with. Isn't that so funny?
So right? Funny.
So there are a lot of branches of that attack on this one particular drug and on several of them, really, and on the individuals like Dr. Corey and so many others who were saying, yeah, actually, this is never mind, right? Like I'm gonna go. For instance, Dr. Corey, I'm gonna go and treat people privately, and you're gonna keep on chasing me out of my work, and I'm gonna continue to treat people because guess what? I'm a doctor. Right, like many of these people who got chased out of work were actually doctors who really did take an oath and they meant it and they care for patients and they really did save people. And that's not what most of these people who ended up making bank on COVID were. And I think so. Just the last 4 paragraphs of this Jeffrey Tucker article in the Brownstone Institute wraps up nicely, I think, a lot of what you're talking about.
Okay.
This is again Tucker. A guy named Jeffrey Tucker, who I think is either the founder or the head of the Brownstone Institute. All this time, while every type of vicious propaganda was unleashed on the world, the pro-lockdown and pro-mandate lobby, including fake scientists and fake studies, were benefiting from millions and billions thrown around by operators of a Ponzi scheme based on cheating, fraud, and $15 billion in leveraged funds that didn't exist, while its principal actors were languishing in a drug-infested $40 million villa in the Bahamas, even as they preened about the virtues of effective altruism and their pandemic planning machinery that has now fallen apart. Then, the New York Times, instead of decrying this criminal conspiracy for what it is, writes puff pieces on the founder and how he let his quick-growing company grow too far, too fast, and now needs mainly rest, bless his heart. The rest of us are left with the bill for this obvious scam that implausibly links crypto and COVID. But just as the money was based on nothing but puffed air, the damage they have wrought on the world is all too real. A lost generation of kids, declined lifespans, millions missing from the workforce, a calamitous fall in public health, millions of kids in poverty due to supply chain breakages, 19 straight months of falling real incomes, historically high increases in debt, and a dramatic fall in human morale the world over. So yes, we should all be furious and demand full accountability at the very least. Whatever the final truth, it is likely to be far worse than even the egregious facts listed above. It's bad enough that lockdowns wrecked life and liberty. To discover that vast support for them was funded by fraud and fakery is a deeper level of corruption that not even the most cynical among us could have imagined. Well, you're not cynical, but you did imagine it. And imagine is the wrong word here. You did you did see it coming at some level, to some degree, and as it was happening, you did predict it, and that's what this time traveling
money printer.
It's a terrible set of words together, but this time traveling money printer concept of yours is getting at.
Well, there's one more thing it's getting at, unfortunately. This, believe it or not, it gets far worse soon if we are not wise about at least figuring out whether this is going on and getting to the bottom of FTX. And I believe that in some sense, the game you were about to watch unfold, and I will say, we have predicted the middle ground scramble with respect to COVID, and we have now seen so many versions of it that that prediction has done very, very well. This is another prediction like that. What are we about to see? And one thing we are about to see...
I don't know what you're about to say, but I hope you're wrong.
Me too.
Okay.
Oh, God, yes. Totally. Let's hope I'm wrong.